We are going to have that consultation, call it whatever you want, an accessibility summit, public consultation. Bottom line is that we're going to be discussing with all partners the level of service that is expected, and with that, reaching for those outcomes that we want to establish. So my question is, do you feel that during this process, Mr. Russo, that the airport, CATSA, CBSA, international partners, airlines, and of course, most importantly, the disability community, this would be an opportunity to, in fact, work towards harmonizing those procedures based on the standards established, and then, of course, with that, a strategic plan, action plans, and, of course, executing the deliverables established out of those action plans. Do you think that will, in fact, accomplish this?
Thank you for the question. Certainly, I think it's a good start. A lot of work's going to come out of that because, as you said, it's complex. But certainly, better coordination between the partners will result in a better experience for customers with disabilities. I firmly believe that.
And I guess how much time do I have, Mr. Chair? Oh, great. And I really want to emphasize this. You know, this is about two things. It's about caring and it's about respect. And at the end of the day, we want to ensure that before the sometimes iron fist goes down with respect to decisions that can be made, like the motion that was just brought forward, we have to consider the consequences of those decisions. And with that, recognizing that mobility aids are not just luggage, rather an extension of one's body and as well their independence. So I guess my second question, Mr. Russo, to you is what, and I'd like to get a bit granular on this, what have you moved forward with now, which is tangible, and what can you bring to the table as part of your sector with other partners to actually move forward with reaching those outcomes that are expected by the disability community?
Thank you for the question. So in terms of mobility aids, what we've done recently is changed our policy where we are allowing as many mobility aids as we can into the cabin. And so the customer has it close by. That's in place right now. Second, we've built a technology application where our customers can monitor where their mobility aid is, ensure it's in the cargo bay. And then within the cargo bay, two important aspects. One, mobility aids will be treated as priority, and so they'll go on last and come off first. So they're available for the customer when the customer comes off the plane. And two, and this is an important area, we have changed our internal processes to try and isolate the mobility aid so it does not get broken or damaged. As you know, planes do hit turbulence once in a while, and so we want to make sure that that mobility aid is strapped into the cargo bay, either by itself or away from any other cargo that exists to minimize the risk of damage. So I think those are four strong initiatives that we've already put in place, and we'll continue to look at more, working with our partners and working with experts.
Thank you very much, Mr. Russo, and I'd like to thank you, Mr. Rowe, Mr. Stevens, and of course, Ms. Wilson, for your testimony today on this very important study. I'm going to suspend the meeting for 2 minutes to allow for our team to introduce and set up the next round of witnesses. This meeting stands suspended. This meeting back to order. Colleagues, for the second panel, we have appearing before us from Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Alliance, Professor David Lepofsky, who is the chair. Mr. Chair, I want to thank you for being here. And of course, from the Council of Canadians with Disabilities, we have Ms. Heather Owakis, who is the national chair, joining us by video conference. Begin with opening remarks, and for that, I'll turn the floor over to you, Mr. Lepofsky. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and I want to thank the excellent team of law students from the law school at Western who've provided tremendous support for what I'm going to say. Anything that's wrong is my fault. Anything that's right is their fault. Enough is enough. As a blind person, I dread entering Canadian airspace. I never know whether the service I'm going to get for basic accommodation needs that are well known and easy to provide will be reliable or pathetic. We heard from Air Canada today that they're doing a good job, that they've put in place measures that are needed to fix this, that the problems are few or infrequent, and that really all they need is more education or training for their staff. Every single one of those statements is wrong. And that Air Canada's leadership said this is proof that we need far more systemic solutions. Let me offer you some. Number one, the U.S. has a Air Passengers with Disabilities Bill of Rights. Why don't we? It is absurd that on a flight to Atlanta 3 weeks ago, my email from Air Canada told me about the American Bill of Rights, but nothing about the services available as a blind passenger in Canada, even though I'm on record and file as a blind passenger. We need a new regulatory agency to oversee accessibility of air travel. The Canadian Transportation Agency has had this mandate for not years, but decades. They have failed, and they are failing. And it's because they're too close to the airlines. Keep leaving it with them, you're going to keep getting the same results. How surprising is it that so few of us file so few complaints with their process? If you read the accessible air travel regulations they passed in 2019, they are more loopholes than rules. The fact of the matter is, they read like they were written by the airlines. How about another basic solution? Easier than changing the regulatory requirements or regulatory agency. How about requiring airlines to automatically tell us passengers with disabilities what services they offer, not having to go running around their websites, one airline at a time, hoping we can find it, hoping it is up to date. Oh, and assuming that we have a computer and can afford it and have adaptive tech and can use it. How about mandatorily requiring something like the U.S. Bill of Rights for passengers with disabilities? How about telling us in every notification who to call for a support, who to call for curbside assistance? This is not rocket science, but they don't do it. How about having one-stop support? How about having a fast action, fast service disability hotline at each airline? You phone it and you don't wait on hold for an hour, and you don't have to listen to miserably nerve-wracking music. You just get someone who can route you through to the solution. It could be the way to request services and to file complaints. How about requiring the airlines on our flights and the airports in their announcements to regularly announce the availability of that hotline? If more people knew how to complain, the CEO of Air Canada wouldn't be coming here telling you how few complaints they get. How about requiring the regulator to deploy secret shoppers so we have independent monitoring of how their services are? You heard from the CEO of Air Canada that they now announce pre-boarding for passengers with disabilities. Not on the Air Canada flight I was on last night to come here. How about having an assured front desk check-in in a large airport like at Terminal 1 in Toronto, where you don't have to try to brave a phalanx of stanchions and check-in machines and other confusing signage and so on, where you could check in right inside the door. Air Canada didn't have it. Let's just say somebody got an interesting idea and eventually they did have it, then they killed it, then I asked them to restore it, then they didn't, then I heard they did, but only for some flights, not others. If you can't figure it out, imagine how I feel. How about requiring that one person will guide you through the whole airport rather than being passed from one person to the next, sometimes as many as 3 or 4, like you're a baton in a relay race. We heard about the need for training. Can I tell you, and I'm just giving you my experience, lots of people with disabilities can tell you the same, how many of their ground assistance persons assigned to guide me, I have to teach how to guide a blind person. Did I mention this is not rocket science? These aren't bad people. They're in a bad system that needs to be fixed. Let me wrap up telling you that there are lots more things we could require, but how about standards for new airport design or aircraft design? I was just on a plane 2 weeks ago where, you know that emergency or that call button to let the flight attendant know you need help? It's always been a physical button, but more and more, it's a touch screen that blind people can't operate. I mean, did they just invent blind people? This is ridiculous. Now, I don't want to make it sound like it's all Air Canada. These need to be done, measures need to be across the board. Air Canada is not the leader that we want airlines to follow. We need them all to become leaders.
Thank you.
And to change their practices. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Lepofsky. Next, we'll go to Ms. Walkus. Ms. Walkus, the floor is yours. Oh, Ms. Walkus, unfortunately, you're on mute. So I'll wait for you to unmute yourself, and then we'll restart the clock for you.
Thank you for letting me know that. Many people like to use the mute button with me. And thank you for having me here. I have been involved in the federal transportation industry and disability since 1979. I was so happy when we finally got regulations, not voluntary codes of practice, that went into effect in June 25th, 2020. Let me tell you, for someone who's been involved internationally and nationally around disability and travel, I thought, what could possibly go wrong now? 2019 looked like we were going to get there in 1 year, right in the middle of the COVID shutdown. Do you think the airlines and the airports stopped at that point? No, they asked for exemptions, exceptions, extensions for putting in mandatory regulatory areas that they had to deal with, that they had a full year ahead. And all of a sudden, because of COVID, oh, we can't do it now. We had to take the disability community and fight that request of the federal cabinet. And we had to have a global reaction to that. We should have been looking after our own people during that time, but we couldn't. Our people were hungry. They couldn't use cash. They couldn't get proper healthcare assist. We were hurting in the disability community, and yet We mounted a campaign against the airlines to stop taking away the regulations we had fought for dozens and dozens of years. This is not new. Everything we try to do to make change with the industry. Now, we're not just talking about Air Canada. We're talking from buses, interprovincial buses, to the interprovincial ferries, to Via Rail. We have had to fight every inch of the way. I noticed last month that some of the discussion was around one person, one fare. The, uh, the Council of Canadians with Disabilities were the ones that went to court against Air Canada to ensure that we had one person, one fare. Then one of our members followed that up with another court case to allow room for guide dogs and service dogs to be able to stretch out because they immediately had to work after getting off a carrier. Since those times and since those very important court cases, we've also went against it via rail because they were buying inaccessible rail cars. And we fought them. We won that. And the big principle that came out of that fight, that legal fight, was you cannot end a barrier by creating more. So we have regulations that embody those, some of those legal precedences that we set from the disability community. We didn't get any help. We had to do that on our own. We're still doing it on our own. And the biggest issue right now is that systemically, it is not accessible. If a person wants to utilize one person, one fare, every carrier does it differently. Every carrier wants a doctor's certificate. Every carrier uses a different type of certificate. They undermine what has already been won, and I call it a death by 1,000 cuts. Every time we try to enact what is already in place, there's some new barrier to change that we have to then fight that. It's like whack-a-mole. Every time you try to do something, it hits. I'll tell you just a few of the ridiculousness that David was talking about is that I met up with a person who had just started on the accessibility desk for Air Canada at YVR. She was shaking. It was her first time she'd ever met a person with a disability. And it's a good thing I'm a nice person because I helped her through it. And I spent more time supporting her. But she, through 2 weeks in a classroom, had never met a person with a disability. The question I have is, why is it everyone's talking about us? Everybody is doing their best for us without us. We've been here. We are always here. We are not stakeholders. Stakeholders come in, set the parameters of rule of what they're in charge of. We are rights holders. When you look in the Constitution, Section 15, people with disabilities is in there. It's at the very end because in the first draft we weren't included. We had to fight for that too, but we're there. And every time we have to mount yet another campaign, another legal challenge, it takes people away from their families, from their regular life, and we are all volunteers. We are not paid to do this. I am the chair of the largest, oldest disability rights organization in this country. We are 48 years old. We have run mainly by volunteers, and we have made great strides to get us to where we are, but we need you. We need this committee, and I'm so blessed to be here. We need this committee to not just give recommendations, but to follow them through. I would have loved to have sat in this morning and been able to ask Air Canada questions. This big summit that's happening in a couple of months, the disability community has never been consulted around that. We need to be at the table with the same authority and speak from that same authority to ask the questions of Air Canada. They wove a pretty picture this morning, and some of it is pretty. They have done some good work, and they have great staff. But systemically, when you try to get through with them, it's impossible. And I want to leave you with a very ugly picture. WestJet, when a person who's larger than the seats will allow, within one person, one fare, that legal fight saw obesity as a disability. And when you have to get that seat, then the meeting process is you have to have your butt measured. You have to put it on paper. A doctor has to sign it off, try finding a doctor. And then you have to send it in. WestJet has an algorithm that they spent a lot of money on, and it is proprietary. And they take those numbers and they decide whether you get the extra seat or not. It is demeaning, embarrassing, expensive, and why many people with disabilities are not traveling anymore, because they're harmed.
Thank you.
They're harmed through the process. So I'll leave it there for now. I'd love
Thank
to
you, Ms.
answer any
Walkes.
questions.
I didn't want to cut off your opening remarks. I just want to make sure that all the members here are able to ask you the questions they need to ask you and to get your point of view and your expertise on record. We'll begin our line of questioning today with Mr. Strahl. Mr. Strahl, you have 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lepofsky, I found your comments about being handed off 3 or 4 times in an airport like a baton, I think you said, to be interesting. We've been talking about making sure that people are treated with respect, with dignity, and are provided a good service from the time they get out of their vehicle or whatever transport they've used to get to the airport until they're seated in the aircraft. So can you perhaps talk about whether your comments were focused largely on Air Canada? I assume that's who you've had the most experience with. Has it been any different when you've traveled with any other domestic Canadian airlines? And when you travel, for instance, you referenced the United States. I see in some prepared remarks here you've also traveled to Israel, et cetera. Where have you had the best experience in terms of, and with what airline, in terms of not being passed from person to person through the airport?
Thank you. Number one, I've talked a lot about Air Canada, but it's not limited to Air Canada in terms of my experience in Canada. Number two, my better experiences is anywhere outside this country. I'm sorry to say that. And I'm embarrassed as a Canadian to say that. But it proves others can get it right. Why the heck can't we? When I talked about being passed like a baton, for the longest time, for decades, at Terminal 1 in Toronto, you came through with one person taking you from the airplane all the way through customs and getting your bags and out the door and into a cab. Now, because some geniuses put their heads together and thought this was a better thing, for the last 10, 15, 20 meters, maybe 50, you have to be passed to an airport authority person. Literally, for the last few meters. And you spend more time having the two ground officials taking your boarding pass and scanning that you're leaving one and being passed to the other one than it takes to get out the darn door. Try that after a 13-hour flight when you just want to get home and go to bed. When you come in at Toronto, again at Pearson at Terminal 1, and I'm just going to give this as an illustration. We haven't audited right across the airport. We can't. We're volunteers. But it's important for you to understand this. You come into the counter, and then they tell you to sit and wait, sometimes upwards of an hour, but the seats aren't right next to where the staff are. So you're sitting there for an hour. You can't ask somebody, hey, where's the bathroom? a couple of flights ago, I actually thought they had forgotten me. There's no one to ask, so I just stood up. I heard someone sound like an airport, and how's this for dignity? Standing up and bellowing, "Excuse me, do you work for the airlines?" Like, why should we have to do that? Similarly, on the way out, again, depending on this baton passing, you could be escorted from the aircraft to a seating area before you go through customs and then told to wait, someone will come and get you. You ask, how long? They don't know, and they leave. There's no staff there to ask. I've sat there hearing somebody in another seat next to me saying, I need help. I need to go to the bathroom. This is an adult in public in an airport. Welcome to Canada. This is not the way we should be treated.
And this, in all of these experiences, you have, obviously, when you've booked your ticket, informed the airline that you require extra assistance, and they're still unprepared to deliver a seamless service.
It's totally inconsistent. There are times you get, the people are nice. Don't get me wrong. The people are nice. They're not surly. They don't need sensitivity. Excuse me. They need staff sufficient and a system that says from the aircraft all the way out the door. Some do it. It varies from day to day, flight to flight. And yes, in my file, before I do a booking, it's automatically set out that I have a vision disability and that I need ground assistance. And usually when I book the reservation and I get the electronic ticket, it says it right there. But it doesn't tell you who to call for help. One last thing, just getting from the front curb into the airport. Why should this be so complicated? Why can't there be a one-stop phone number to call? Instead, you've got to figure out different airlines do it differently. And if you've got the wrong number, there's nowhere to call to get the right number. So it's just, anyway, none of this is tough. This just requires, and by the way, the last thing, and I want to focus on this just for a minute, sir, if I may. Senior executives of airlines need to be held personally accountable. Not just that they can hire a Carrie-Ann Wilson, who's a really good person and really dedicated, and then tell people like me, go talk to her. That's what he told you. When he was pressed about what he meet. With me, it was, well, me or her. It would be good to talk to her. They need to not be shielded by people. They need to talk to us directly. And I'd be happy to if he would be agreeable to meet.
Thank you very much, Mr. Strahl, and thank you, Mr. Lepofsky. Next, we have Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, the floor is yours. You have 6 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome to our guests today. Ms. Walkus and then Mr. Lepofsky, maybe you can make comments after the fact, due to the question here. We've heard from WestJet, Air Canada, airlines. We've heard from airport personnel from CAT, who've all claimed they have some sort of assistance programs in place. Yet, we've seen and heard of the stories of mistreatment and neglect, some of which you've alluded to today in your travels. So can you speak to, Ms. Walkus, first of all, to the end-to-end service and potentially share where you think the gaps are in the airline industry?
Okay, in the airline industry, the gaps are right from the time you try to get online and book a ticket. Most of us have to then go through the medical desk, and then depending on who's on that desk and how they feel that day, there is no consistent way that the regulations are even looked at. They look at their own personal policies. So that will determine whether you actually get a seat or a seat you need. And they predetermine everything from whether you get the second seat for a guide dog, whether you get the second seat for a support person. And by the way, they charge you taxes on that seat, which they're not allowed to do, but they do anyway. So that needs to be resolved. When you get to, and as David alluded to and said, every airport is different. Winnipeg, they now have a kiosk, unfortunately. It has, when you get to the curb, it has flat screen, so someone like me who's blind can't use it. Vancouver Airport, you call the main number, but it doesn't have a code for accessibility so that you can just call someone. If you call over to Ottawa Airport, they do. They said, if you're coming to the curb, press 3 and I'll get somebody. And somebody actually answers the phone and talks to you and arranges what time you'll be there approximately by the taxi. And they're there waiting for you. And as David said, there's no consistency. Every airline that flies out of this country does not follow the rules of Canada because they're all domestic. We need to change that. I don't think Global Affairs should make a decision on what is right for Canada, whether we're going to go after and make changes, that those regulations also are for international. I personally have spent 4 hours parked at a gate waiting for a flight. No one's come to see me. No, there's no way to contact anyone. I'm having to go to the washroom. I can't get something to eat. I cannot use any of the airport services. We're moved like luggage from one end to the other. And sometimes, as David said, there's 4 or 5 people involved. The way they move us is really demeaning. Sometimes you have to climb up onto a cart, a golf cart that physically you may not be able to get up on, and they put their hands on your hips and they push you up onto it. And then when you get to the other end, they might park you at somewhere and you have to wait for a person to show up with a wheelchair. And then that person will take you to another section where they drop you off again. And so it's this constant going through and not being able to even grab a bite to eat because most of the people that are helping you are not assigned to help you from the airlines.
Could I ask you
They actually have to run back.
Ms.
Yeah.
Walkers, could I ask you if some of the training that's alluded to by the airline people is improving the situation any?
I think the training the attitude is different. I've noticed that in the last few months that I travel. But what I'm noticing too is that they're not empowered to make decisions on the ground. When something comes up with a person with a disability and you say, oh, I need this. Oh, I don't know if I'm allowed to take you to get something to eat. And they have to check. So they're not empowering their frontline people and making them feel like it's okay that they made that decision, what was best for that customer.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lepofsky, could you elaborate on some of the things I referred to there? And
Sure. With respect to training and all the other things Air Canada said, they're doing all this, but we are still having the same problems. Ergo, we need substantially more legislated, enforced systemic solutions. That's the 19 that are in our brief. Number 2, let me say with respect to the issue of training, here's another systemic problem. I've had somebody guiding me recently in an airport, and I've said, oh, do you do this? Is this your full-time job? They said, no, they rotate us. Sometimes they're on the front desk, the check-in desk, sometimes they're elsewhere. So if they're trained, they may not actually put that training into effect till much later. If we train them, we seem to have to do too often, again, they may get rotated somewhere else after. Why not have a team of people with, this is what they do? Again, do they need a retired lawyer and part-time law prof to tell them how to do this stuff? What are they paid for? Seriously.
Ms. Walkers, back to you again. So you believe the companies like WestJet and Air Canada, which made $2 billion last year, according to the CEO, should be investing in new aircraft, new technology to better serve Canadians and passengers with accessibility needs? And what kind of equipment or pieces, things that you have thought about or promote to the companies?
Okay, one of the things is when you get on and there's that flat screen in front of you when you sit on an airplane, I can't use it. And it has 90% of the information about what's going on that airplane on it. It isn't a talking screen and it's flat. I don't know, there's no buttons to push. So I pay the same fare as any other customer on that plane, yet I can't use that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rogers, and thank you, Ms. Walkus. Prochainement, nous avons Mr. Barcelou-Duval. À vous.
Mr. Barcelou-Duval, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Earlier on in the testimony from Air Canada, we were told that only 0.15% of cases were those of... Sorry, Mr. Barcelou-Duval. I just want to make sure...
The translation?
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to confirm you were. Excuse-moi, Mr. Barcelou-Duval.
Go ahead, you may continue, Mr. Barcelou-Duval. So what I was saying is that Air Canada, or its representatives, were saying that they have 0.15 or 0.15% of cases where there are complaints from people who have mobility aids or persons with disabilities. You seem to be you seem to travel a fair bit yourselves, Ms. Walkus. Is it true that it's only 0.15% of the times that you travel that you have problems occur? How frequently do these things actually occur?
For me, 95% of the time. In fact, I can't remember one trip that there wasn't a major issue for me, either almost missing my flight or being parked somewhere. It's almost every time. And again, as David said, we are spending an inordinate amount of time training their staff.
Monsieur Lepofsky.
Mr. Lepofsky?
Disability I talk to about this, and I get lots of feedback in my leadership role with my coalition. Everyone has had problems. I'm not meaning all the time. I don't even know if it's most of the time. But whenever we get on a plane, we never know what we're in for, and we have to be ready for the worst. But let's take that statistic and let's tear it apart. Most of us, I think, I certainly can say for myself, I have not filed complaints about 99.9% of the incidents. I wouldn't have time to eat, sleep, or do anything else if that's all I did. Number two, I dare say most people don't know how or where to file complaints, even if they want to. That should be announced in the airports. That should be announced on every flight. That should be included on every ticket. Number three, lots of people travel on our airlines but end up outside Canada. And when they get back to their home countries, if they've had a bad experience, you think they're calling up to find out which regulatory agency deals with the problems they faced and how to file a complaint, and they're going to get involved in some long legal process? I don't think so. So when Air Canada comes up with those numbers, or any other airline, they're, forgive me, but they're in effect trivializing what we're facing.
That's right.
Now, in fairness, the CEO of Air Canada said he knows it's underreported and he knows there are more, so I want to be fair to that. But to be able to say you're doing a good job and these are the numbers is to be shockingly out of touch with our experience. And there's just a huge coincidence that the only people who happen to talk to me about this who have disabilities have had these problems, or it's a bigger problem. And I leave it to you to decide which it is.
Merci.
Thank you. That answers my question very well. Which leads me somewhere else. Mr. Lepofsky, let's continue with you. In your opening statement, you referred to the CTA, and you seem to be dissatisfied. Could you tell us a little bit about the ways in which perhaps you have had to have dealings with the CTA? You said that you don't fill out a complaint every time. What is the issue with the CTA, the Canadian Transportation Agency, as to the ways in which these complaints are dealt with?
Okay, the first problem is there's no rapid solution. I mean, if you file a complaint, better be ready for a very, very long process. And to be honest, life's too short. Okay, like we can't live that way and have a life. The second problem is they are too close to the airlines industry. It's a classic example of the recurring problem of regulatory capture. It's not unique to the CTA, it's not unique to regulators in Canada, but it's obvious. For example, if you read their regulations they passed in 2019, in our brief, we have a link to our critique of those regulations when they were under consideration. And they really read like they're written by the airlines. They're just way too, you've got to do this, except. You're required to do X, except. And then there's all these loopholes that are bigger than the rights. And so the other final point, even if you were to disagree, and I'm not saying you do, but even if we assume for the moment you disagreed with everything I just said, the bottom line is this. They are mandated to regulate airlines' accessibility. They've had that mandate for decades. That didn't come with the Accessible Canada Act. They've had it for decades. These problems have existed for decades. In significant ways, they've not gotten better, and in some ways, they've gotten worse. So the regulator has failed to achieve the result that we are entitled to.
Thank you very
much.
much.
If you keep going back to them, I suspect you're going to get the same result.
Thank you, Mr. Lepofsky. And thank you, merci, Mr. Barclay-Duval. Next, we have Mr. Bachrach. Mr. Bachrach, the floor is yours. You have 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to, again, thank you, Professor Lepofsky, for being here and for stating so clearly and adamantly what the problem is and the urgency of making progress on this. And I'm trying to decide where to start and how to add to this conversation with some questions. But it seems like from listening to you that the two themes that have really come up are around consistency and accountability. And I share your frustration because this committee hears from many corporations who come here and tell us about their good works from very well-meaning people. And it feels, after many meetings like that, that it's too great of an expectation to expect these companies to proactively and voluntarily address these systemic issues. Where does the buck stop when it comes to accountability?
Number one, with the regulator that's not holding them accountable. Number two, with the CEOs. And number three, and we're not partisan when I say this, but with the ministers and the government that have the authority to do it. A summit is a photo op. Excuse me, but it's like they may discuss things, they may come out with good stuff, but they don't need to wait 2 months for a summit to deal with the 19 issues that are in our brief. And the 19 recommendations are not like something that we somehow magically innovated they couldn't have thought of, like having people know what rights they have and where to get service at the airline. I mean, my theme again, it's not rocket science. So what we need is concrete action. The other thing is, with respect to the airlines and the CTA having consultative committees, and that's great, where they bring some people with disabilities they ask, but these are recurring problems. I'm not saying anything that people with disabilities, and I believe airlines haven't known about for years and decades. So it's not that they need to hear more from us. They need to actually do something about it. And it would be wrong for this committee to sort of recommend, and I'm not saying you're going to, but to think the solution is tell each airline to set up a disability advisory committee so that we have to volunteer our services to these for-profit companies to keep telling them one after the other the exact same thing. The solution is to legislate the requirements, effectively enforce them. And that's what we've listed in our brief.
So effective legislation, effectively enforced, and the buck stops with the minister who's responsible for the regulator and for setting the parameters within which the airlines operate?
And the CEOs.
And the CEOs.
Absolutely. And I'm not trying to be personal to the CEO of any airline. It happens that one was here today. And I am sure they're all well-intentioned, but in the disability world, everybody's well-intentioned towards us. But we keep facing the barriers. So the solution is saying, if the CEO of each airline said to their airlines, no more passing people like a baton, no more seating people where they have to call out to strangers if they need to go to the bathroom. Let's tell everybody what single number they got to call for help, and it will actually get answered in, 5 minutes. not an hour? If they all did that, and if they said there are consequences down the line if it doesn't happen, it could happen.
Mr. Lepowski, why do you think the minister has been so reluctant to, or seems to be so reluctant to take that decisive action that you've just described?
I've never spoken to the minister. We've had no contact with him, and I can't comment on it. My only reason for focusing on it is because of the news release yesterday about a summit. And I don't want to make like whatever they do is wrong and all that stuff. We're not like that. It's just we need action, not photo ops. If they do a photo op and do action, we'll say yay. Okay, don't get me wrong.
So in your view, the government knows what needs to be done. They've had lots of time to do it. And in response to this litany of horrifying stories involving people with disabilities trying to travel, and we heard testimony from the chief accessibility officer, and she very much echoed what you've said, which is that every single person that she knows that has a disability and travels has had problems. Given the severity of that situation, you think that the government has all the information that it needs to act. Is that what I'm hearing?
As does the Canadian Transportation Agency, as does every airline. And they have models from elsewhere in the world they could turn to, because not everybody does it as badly as we do. And that's why I dread entering Canadian airspace. Others do it better. I'm not saying they're all 100% either, but they're more reliable than here.
What are the international leaders when it comes to the type of regulation and enforcement you're talking about?
I can't give you sort of specific regulatory codes and specifics. I'm not prepared for that today, and I apologize. But I could just tell you I don't recall a trip anywhere of the handful of countries or more that I've been to where I have to worry like I have to worry when I come here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lepowski, and thank you, Mr. Bachrach. Next, we have Mr. Muse. Mr. Muse, floor is yours. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both witnesses for very passionate advocacy and some practical solutions, which I know are being captured by the analysts as we look to the report on this. And I just want to pick up on the thread from my colleague, Mr. Bachrach. You said, Mr. Lepowski, right off the top that in the United States there's an Air Passengers with Disabilities Bill of Rights, and that's obviously something that we should look to because we want to we don't want Canada to be an airspace that you dread. And I know that the question was asked about other jurisdictions as to maybe others that are leaders on this, and you weren't prepared for that today, but I don't know if it would be something that you would be able to table at the committee afterwards, if there were other jurisdictions.
If we could find something, we'd be happy to provide it.
Sure. I mean, because obviously we should look to what are far better examples than you're experiencing in Canada.
But frankly, that's also, I mean, the CTA is paid to try to know this stuff, and the federal government should have people who could come before you and give you this. You shouldn't need lay volunteers. I'm not faulting you for asking. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah,
I'm delighted.
I appreciate that. And to that very point, I mean, in terms of the airlines collaborating with advocates like yourself, and I'll ask the same question to Ms. Walkus, because you spoke about the fact that, Ms. Walkus, that you talked to someone who, it was the first time that ever talked to someone with a disability, which is shocking that's the case. And we've heard the case being made for the CTA to be a better regulator, for the minister to at his summit 2 months from now to actually look at some concrete action. But what can, all of that, absolutely. What can the airlines do in addition to work better with advocates like yourself to actually get some practical solutions?
Having advisors from the disability community is not the answer. One of the problems with advice is they can take it or leave it. It doesn't empower the community of people with disabilities to bring forward the solutions or identify the barriers and expect them to change them. That doesn't happen. We've been doing this for decades and decades. This is not new. All of these issues have been on the floor for every government since I remember back in the 70s. This has been sent to the next group, this next group, the next group. Here we are again, coming to you saying not much has changed because people are trying to find the least amount of effort, the lowest cost to deal with what they perceive as the barrier. We are not at the table empowered to say, no, that's not okay. We need to have an open discussion, public, as you're doing today, with us at the table asking them so they're on record with us. Otherwise, the only place we have is the courts. And quite frankly, I'm 68 years old. Can we not just have it common sense way of dealing with this? And the transitions we need to make is that where something stops, there's a gap to the next piece, whether that's legislation, whether that's regulation, or whether that's who is responsible for what. But the biggest issue is there's no teeth in it. $100,000 fine to Air Canada, cost of doing business. It's not going to change anything. And that money doesn't come back to the disability community. It goes in government coffers. So how is that assisting us to move this forward? We are the poorest group, the least amount of power, and yet every single case of movement forward has happened because the disability community has moved it forward. And with you, we can move it even further forward. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'll say you look far younger than 68. So,
Thank
but
you.
One of the things that's been fairly consistent in your comments as well as Mr. Lepofsky's is the inconsistencies in the treatment of airports and at airlines, and I guess maybe just in the remaining seconds to comment how can that be remedied best?
You have to have oversight with teeth.
Yeah. Like, again, inconsistency is in part because people don't tell us where to go if you want to get curbside assistance or have one-stop shopping. They don't have that hotline to call when you're at the airport. I mean, try to get someone at the airport to go to a higher level to solve a problem that the front desk person can't solve because they don't have authority. You can't find anyone. You need that one-stop shopping phone number with somebody with authority to fix it. You need these to be announced regularly. I think that if airline staff and airport staff heard those announcements, if you have a disability-related complaint, call this number, it'll wake people up a little more to say, hey, we should do better. And I want to emphasize, I'm going to gamble that a lot of the frustration I'm describing would be echoed by flight attendants and ground staff. Because when I've talked to them about it, they've echoed that they've seen the same problems we have and that they as individuals find it enormously frustrating.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Lepofsky, and thank you, Mr. Muse. Next, we have Mr. Iacono. Mr. Iacono, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, please.
Je remercie les témoins d'être là.
I'd like to start by thanking the witnesses for being here this morning. I want to thank you for your very touching testimony, and actually, it's quite disturbing to hear the experiences you've had traveling. It's hard to believe that in 2024 we haven't managed to better serve individuals who have accessibility needs. Professor, you have a wide range of experience. We've clearly understood, and we don't have to. I'm very disappointed to hear about your bad experiences, and on behalf of the government, I apologize. I would like to ask you, how can we address this issue best? Address it. Many things need to be done, but what would be one thing that could be done to bring about change? You mentioned a one-stop shop. Is that the ideal solution? That's my first question. My second question, you said you had 19 recommendations. Did you design them based on all of your travel experience all over the world, outside of Canada as well? Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Thank you. I'll tell you that we designed those based on our research, based on feedback that we've been getting from people for, as a community coalition, we get feedback on barriers all the time. We get called by the media about stories and asked to comment on them and so on. So it's kind of an aggregation of that and just traveling and looking around and trying to figure out what works. And of course, my own personal experience is provided. I gave you illustrations from my life, not because I'm the only game in town or in any way important, but because they will make them come alive for you in a way that I think especially is compelling. But as well, we've just tried to apply common sense, like offering the idea of if it's really hard to get from the front door at Pearson Terminal 1 to get all the way through this phalanx of obstacles and a long distance to find where the check-in desk is, and there's so many, the idea of why don't you just have an entrance right inside the door, something which Air Canada did, then undid, then redid, but limited as to who could use it. I mean, again, you shouldn't. That was just one example at a big airport like that. You might not need it in Ottawa because it's a shorter distance to the counter, but at a bigger airport, that would be an illustration of something that's good. There isn't one solution alone. But what I will tell you about the 19 in our brief, the one that I realize will make this would require the most dramatic move is removing the accessibility mandate from the CTA and creating a new agency to deal with it. I realize that's a bigger fish to fry, but the other things in there are all I'd propose quite easy to do, and it's not just one of them.
Professor, just before my time is up, through you, Mr. Chair, is it possible for you to share with us those 19 recommendations?
Yeah, they're in the brief that we filed with you.
Okay, and in it, do you have the examples where you've picked them up? Those 19 recommendations?
We just invented them.
No, I'm sure you didn't invent them.
No, but we explain them.
But from which, is there a reference to where this is being done today, so we have a better picture of where to go to see how it's being done, best practices?
No, there isn't, and we could look to see whether we could do that. If we can, we will.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Iachino. Thank you, Mr. Lepofsky. Prochainement, nous avons Mr. Barcel-Duval.
Mr. Barcelo-Duval. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll continue on my original train of thought. Let's keep going with Mr. Lepofsky. In your opening statement, you said that it would take legislation that would include rights for people with limited mobility, similar to what exists in the United States. Here, of course, you have airline passengers' rights that is in the form of regulations, and it's been the case since 2019. What's the difference between what exists in the U.S. and what exists here from a legal standpoint, and how could we manage to get what they have if it's any better? How could we change or amend what we've got here?
We actually quote it, I believe, in our brief, and it's theirs is just a short list of categorical, clear rights. Now, if we were writing one for Canada, if you, this committee or the government decided we're going to draft one, we might add to it, vary it. We don't need to just carbon copy it. We should take into account some of the problems that this committee has seen. But the idea of having that Bill of Rights, having it be enforceable, having a hotline, and having it mandatorily notified to all passengers when they book a ticket with the airline and so on would help move things forward. And it's not hard, and it's shouldn't be full of the feast of loopholes in the CTA's 2019 regulations. That's what I'd suggest.
Donc, ce que je comprends, c'est que dans ce que vous avez...
From what I gather, in what you submitted, you have a list of rights that people have, example, as opposed to a whole host of loopholes and complicated packages. The simple rights that are easy to interpret, that would lead to better results, according to you? So major principles, basically.
Yes. Well, it doesn't even have to be principles. I mean, the airline shall tell people passengers with disabilities what services are available and what number to reach them at. That's not a principle. It's just a clear direction. So it doesn't have to be kind of lofty, aspirational. It can be concrete entitlement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lepofsky. Merci, Mr. Barcel-Duval. And finally, for today, we have Mr. Bachrach. Mr. Bachrach, the floor is yours. You have 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Lepofsky started by recognizing the